coincidentally, a professor from Queen's contacted me and asked me would I come up and speak to him about something he was doing with police dogs to do with search. And while I was there, I mentioned this lady, and then if it was from that that I ended up on this PhD journey, which has been 6 years, well, 5.5 years. But anyway, the outcome of it is quite exciting. So I'll get started into it now. So what happened was we first of all needed to find out, are dogs actually predicting epileptic seizures? And if so, is it unique to one area of the world, or is it all over? So we conducted an international survey, and we basically asked people who were living with epilepsy, whether they were dog owners or not dog owners, to respond to the survey. And as you can see there, we got 229 respondents, and interestingly, most of those were female. And for some reason, females are far better at answering online surveys than males. I have no idea why that would be. Probably they're more switched on than males. But of that, there were 144 dog owners, and as you can see there, 85 non-dog owners. Of the dogs that were registered, you can see there's 70% of them reacted to seizure. Now, some of these were before seizure, some of them were after or during seizure. So the frequency of the alerting, this was very interesting too, because you can see every time a person had a seizure, 45% of the dogs in the survey came and told them in some way that they were having or about to have a seizure. It could be up to 2 hours ahead, it could be 5 minutes ahead, but it was always ahead. 37% most times. Now, those dogs that were most times could have been dogs who were, say, out in the garden having a play at the time when the person was in the house. So you wouldn't necessarily take it that they sort of sometimes did and sometimes didn't. It's just that they weren't probably in the area at the time. The ones would be less reliable would be the 15% and the 3%. So the bottom line is that most of the dogs that were owned are predicting epileptic seizure. This went across all dog breeds and both genders, which was very interesting. And the pre-seizure alerting was also not restricted to any one type of seizure. That itself was really interesting, I felt. So, while the results of the survey support the belief held by many that dogs can predict epilepsy, the problem was that there was no scientific support for that. And so that's where we had to conduct a research which would sort of examine the thing in more detail. So we attempted to address the issue by measuring attention-seeking behaviors in pet dogs when they detected seizure odors. Now, the reason for that is that all the people who told us that their dogs were predicting their seizures were all doing it principally in 3 ways. They would come and stare at them, they would bark at them, or they would paw them, or jump up and lick around the mouth, or just rest their heads on their laps. So those are the 3 principal attention-seeking behaviors that the dogs were using. So that's what we decided to focus on. And the results of that are really interesting, and they do strongly suggest that there is a seizure-related scent involved in this. Now, there are other possibilities as well, and I will admit that. So it seems that people in the survey were right, and that dogs actually can predict epileptic seizures. Now, the question then is, why might dogs react to seizure onset? Now, various suggestions have come up, but there were 3 principal ways. One organization in England called Support Dogs UK have been trying very hard to get dogs to react to epileptic seizure, and they use minor changes in the body. So the dogs are trained to look for these minor changes, and then to respond by coming to the owner and letting them know that you're about to have a seizure. But I wasn't convinced that the dogs were actually doing that in all cases, simply because, as you can see there, in the survey that results that we got, 58% of the alerting dogs had actually come from a different room to warn the owners. In fact, in one case, a lady from Galway contacted me directly, and she said that she was standing at the cooker one day and she was about to drain off a saucepan full of boiling water from potatoes or the spuds. And this dog that she had, which was a retriever, came from a different room, got between her and the cooker and pushed her sideways away from the cooker. Now, she didn't know why he was doing that. So she went and sat down, and within 5 minutes, she had a seizure. So the dog not only predicted her seizure from another room, but took an action that safeguarded her, which I thought was amazing. The other possibility is that people might make a small sound of some sort, which the dogs might cue into. I think that is a possibility, yes, but it's not as strong as the fact that I think it was a seizure associated scent or odor. And given the fact that dogs have an uncanny ability to detect scent, that seemed to me and to us the most likely. Now, I have to say, this research program that I engaged in was supervised by Professor Gareth Arnott and Professor Alistair Ruffle of Queen's University, both of whom were absolutely brilliant the whole journey through. They were amazing people. And I want to pay tribute to them. Therefore, our research asked two questions. One was, can dogs really detect epileptic seizures without any training whatsoever? And if so, what makes them do it? So the way we did this was we explored the impact of Seizure Scent on a group of 19 pet dogs owned by people without epilepsy. Now, it's important that you take note of the fact here that none of these dogs had ever witnessed an epileptic seizure before, and none of the dog owners had epilepsy. The reason for that was I felt, well, if pet dogs are able to predict epileptic seizure, and I take a group of pet dogs randomly and expose them to the odor of seizure, surely then they should react as has been reported in our survey. So that was the basis of the experiment. But the problem then was I had to find a way to trick the dogs into believing that their owners who did not have epilepsy were actually experiencing an epileptic seizure. How is it going to do that? Well, you could, I suppose, put the samples of sweat associated with seizure in people's say in their socks or something like that. But the problem with that is it's messy and there's residual odors and all the rest of it. So what we did was we found a way of tricking the dogs. So this is the actual experiment itself. The reaction of the dogs were recorded, and as they detected seizure odors, we compared that reaction with how they reacted to non-seizure odors. Now, during the delivery of the seizure odors, I had no idea what was coming next. Was it a seizure odor or was it a control odor? All I was doing was watching the dogs. Somebody else was actually controlling the presentation of odors. So what we did was we put out an appeal which went all over the place and asked for people with epilepsy who had dogs that were already alerting them on seizures. Now, these were dogs that were just, as I say, pet dogs. And so what these owners did was they provided us underarm sweat samples using these little sterilized gauze pads. The reason that we used the armpits was that they contain these things called epicrine sweat glands, which we believe are an excellent source of biological samples. Now, various researchers have sort of looked at skin samples of sweat and breath and saliva and so on, but according to these two people here, Sakuda and Ma, who's a GP in America, they reckon the armpits were the most reliable source. So what we did was we first of all needed a pre-seizure sample. So we asked the volunteers to wait until their dogs alerted them on an impending seizure. Then what they were asked to do was to place the gauze pads under each arm and leave them there for roughly 3 minutes. It doesn't have to be exact. And then they were put into Ziploc bags and stored in the fridge. Now, some people like to, in experimental work using scent, will freeze samples. But according to the research that's available at the moment, freezing doesn't really work. It denatures the samples. It'll interrupt the gases that come off. So you're better off just putting them in the fridge or leaving them at room temperature. So once the person had done the pre-seizure samples, they were then asked to put fresh gauzes in the armpits, and then they were to await the arrival of a seizure. So the gauzes were still in their arms while they were having a seizure. Afterwards, then the samples would be removed by a family member and stored in the same way in Ziploc bags in the fridge or at room temperature. And then 6 hours after the seizure was finished, we took more samples and we stored them as post-seizure samples. Now, that turned out to be a bit of a mistake because 6 hours was too soon, really, after a seizure for the odors to dissipate. But that came out in the actual research. So in order to convince the dogs or trick the dogs into thinking that their non-epileptic owner was about to have a seizure, we devised this piece of apparatus called a remote odor delivery mechanism. And all it did was, as you can see there, is it pumped seizure sample odors from a separate room, a preparation laboratory, to a room in which the owner was sitting on a chair. And the dog was not asked to do anything. Now, these dogs that we were using were brought into the experimental laboratory and allowed to wander around the room just to get used to it before we did any of this work. But I'll show you now, the apparatus we use is basically that. It's just a simple aquarium pump attached to a piece of aquarium tubing. There was an airtight chamber in which we were able to put the scent sample, whether it was the sample of a seizure or whether it was a control sample. In other words, control samples were samples from people who did not have epilepsy. They just gave us sweat samples from under the arms after they'd done, like, I think it was something like 5 minutes brisk exercise. So from that scent chamber, there was a tube that was about, I suppose, about 30, 40 feet long, went from one room to another to where the person who was participating was on a chair, just sitting in the chair. There were 2 pipes came from that. There were 2 separate pieces of equipment. So one was for the seizure odors, and the other was for the control odors. So there was no contamination of scent. So 2 separate pipes were running out to a point just below the participants' legs. You'll see this in a wee video in a minute. And then we recorded the whole thing. Now, this is one of the dogs we used was Taz, who's a German Shepherd. And Taz had no epilepsy training whatsoever. He's just a wee family pet dog, well, a very large family pet dog. And the owner decided, quite happy to let us use him and her for this. So first we let Taz smell a non-epilepsy odor, which he thought was coming from his owner, who's called Anne. Now, people who were at the conference a couple of years ago will have seen this already, so I apologize for that, but it is really very, very good little video. Let's see if I can get rid of that. So this is a non-epilepsy odor. This is just sweat sample from somebody who doesn't have seizures. And all I want you to do is, and you'll see the two pipes coming out from under Anne's legs. So one of those pipes is delivering an odor at the minute, which is just to do, it's just sweat from somebody who doesn't have epilepsy. And you can see that Taz wanders off. He's not in the least bit bothered by this. She, meanwhile, has been asked not to engage in any way with the dog, because if she does, that could actually trigger the dog into showing her more attention than he needs to. Now he comes over and gives her a bit of a nudge, because that's him just being friendly, and then he's wandering around again. And that's basically all he does now. If you look at the next one, this is where we use now a seizure-related odor coming from Anne. Now, if you notice the difference here, so he's looking, he was nudging her, so this is eye contact, touch, there's the eyes again. Now, this was a seizure odor. There's a person over there where he's looking, as almost you could say, is he looking for help? This is what dogs do, apparently. If the owner doesn't respond, they run off and find somebody else, and they annoy them. This gets more excitable as it goes on. Now, the main thing to notice here is he's staying with her. Now, this is all completely untrained. And it becomes more and more persistent. He's not at all stressed, as you can see from his tail. He's wagging away. And he's staring at her now, looking for help again. So the result was that when Taz detected non-seizure scent, he wasn't really that interested. Whereas when he detected seizure-related scent, he became very clingy, looked at Anne more than normal, and would turn to look at other people in the lab. One person in particular he seemed to focus on. So what we learned from this was intense staring was the most frequently seen response by the dogs. And we noticed that across all three seizure phases, the pre-seizure, seizure, and post-seizure. And staring has been found in a separate survey. I actually wanted to look to see was there more up-to-date surveys on this, but I didn't get time, so apologies for that. But Mills et al. Found that in 2010, 78% of the way dogs communicate with human beings is with their eyes. So during the seizure and post-seizure phases, the dogs became clingy towards their owners, but this was not seen in the pre-seizure phase. Now, this was the sort of clinging and hanging around, and that is the actual second most frequently seen way dogs communicate. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a reason why in the pre-seizure stage, the dogs were not as clingy. At least I think this is a possible answer to that. To get the pre-seizure odors, we needed dogs who are already doing this behavior to warn their owner that they're about to have a seizure. Now, the pre-seizure odor, in other words, depended on, one, the dog predicting the seizure onset, and two, the owner actually seeing that the dog was trying to warn them. If either of those was a little bit variable in reliability, then there is a possibility that the pre-seizure odor would not be as accurate as it could be. And I suspect that was the reason why we had a sort of a bit of a glitch there. There was also marked increases in pawing or jumping up. on owners during the seizure phase, but not in the pre-seizure or post-seizure phases. So pawing and nudging is the third most frequently reported, but it only represents about 66% of the way dogs will communicate. So it's interesting that the most frequently seen behavioral response among dogs, which is eye contact, was the one that went across all three seizure phases. The second most seemed to be restricted, as you can see there, to seizure and post-seizure, and the least of them, the pawing and jumping, during the seizure phase, but not in pre-seizure or post-seizure. So the seizure phase, I imagine, is when the odor is at its strongest. The question then comes about as to why do dogs behave in this way? And all we know is that seizure odor does seem to trigger attention-seeking behavior in dogs, but why should it do that? That's a separate question, and it's quite a complex question. But the thing is that we will not be able to smell this seizure scent. Generally speaking, you can't anyway, because our sense of smell, as you can see there, is at the very most 100,000 times less than that of a dog. The dogs, there was an experiment done with dogs where they were trained to find a particular odor. And then what they did was they diluted that odor constantly until at the very end, dogs were able to find 1.46 parts per trillion when they had diluted the thing. And that is an astonishing ability. It really, really is. Now, since we did this research, others have been looking at it as well. Dr. Ma in America has been very interested in all of this, but there's a girl called Kitala, Emily Kitala. She's in France, and she has now separately confirmed that epilepsy seizure scent, regardless of seizure type, is detectable by dogs up to 2 hours pre-seizure. But what they did, which was different to what we did, was that they used dogs that were already trained in some way to do this. But it was a separate way of looking at the topic, but it actually confirms what we did, if you like. And some researchers now believe that the main component is a seizure gas called menthone, which apparently is I think it's like a peppermint oil. Now, there was actually 7, so they did this analysis, gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, and they came out with 7 different, what they call volatile organic compounds, VOCs, that were associated with seizures. But the one that seemed to stand out the most was this menthone. I'm not a chemist. In fact, I'm not even an academic. I'm just somebody who has a great interest in dogs and was really keen to find out what's going on here. But these clever people have come up with this menthone. Now that's quite interesting for the future, I hope. And I'm hoping that this will stimulate an interest in developing an electronic nose, if you will, for predicting epileptic seizure. Something like a smartwatch. I mean, that would be the way to go if it was possible. So what we've got now is the possibility that dogs can be reliably trained to detect seizure onset. And I always laugh when I look at that picture. It's a great day getting a treat. I hope you can see it. So it's done by teaching the dog that when he detects a seizure scent, he gets a reward. And that's a very straightforward procedure. All you need to do is get your samples from seizure, the way I explained earlier on, from the armpits, and you teach the dog that every time he finds this scent, he'll get a reward. Now, you can do this in parallel with, you can teach the dog at the same time, separately, that when you give a command touch, the dog will come over and nudge your leg or nudge your hand or something. So you train the two separately. The touch thing is trained separately to the seizure detection thing. But eventually you put the two together so that when the dog uh, is able to pick up this odor, he'll come over and he'll automatically start touching your hand or your leg. So the dog, once he's learned to detect this odor, you then start hiding it um, on your person, and he's taught to check you out. So you'll walk into the room with this in your sock or something like that, these gauzes in your sock. The dog will detect it, and then you will start giving the command, touch, and the dog will come over and touch you, and he's rewarded for that. He knows he will eventually learn the only time he gets rewarded is when he detects the odor and touches you. So when he does detect seizure onset, he or she must paw, nudge his owner. Now, if the owner is, for whatever reason, not able to acknowledge or to be aware of that touch, then the dog will be trained to go to another room, find somebody else, and to give the warning to them. And that's quite straightforward, really. So as I see it, the seizure alert dog will now help to do these three things. It help to reduce risk of injury, give people with seizures more independent lifestyle, and allow time for medical intervention. So if you think about that, if the dog comes and touches you, if you have the medication to reduce the effect of seizure, that gives you an opportunity to take that under medical advice, or to hit an alarm to a carer to say, look, I'm about to have a seizure here, I need help. But it also means that in the case of, like, there was a young girl I helped with her dog, Shannon, her name was Shannon, who lives in Bangor, and at 18, she suddenly started developing epilepsy, no reason whatsoever. She got to become a recluse. She was afraid to leave her house because of the dangers associated with it, and also the embarrassment associated with it, because there's still a big social stigma out there. And that poor girl lived for a year afraid to leave her house. Now, she got a puppy just to keep her company, a Labrador called Poppy. And one day, Poppy started to show strange behavior, and she thought, why is that? And the next thing she knew, she was having a seizure. She became more and more aware of this. And then it seemed that Poppy was predicting her seizures, even as a small pup. She was only about 3 or 4 months old at that time. And then she contacted me and asked, is it possible that my dog could be telling me about epilepsy? And I said, yeah, it is possible. Let's have a look. So between us, we trained the dog to give her a more reliable indicator that she was about to have a seizure. And what that did was it changed her life. She was able to go out with the dog then in public places, and the dog would let her know, you're about to have a seizure, and she was able to make herself safe. So the take-home message from all of this, I see it, is that dogs can predict epileptic seizures by as much as an hour. Now, I say an hour, some dogs will be 10 minutes, some will be 5 minutes, some will be 2 hours. In one case, a dog was 24 hours ahead of a seizure. Why that should be, I have no idea in the wide world, but apparently this is what they're doing. And they tell their owners in 4 principal ways. The first is, as I said earlier on, they will stare intently at them. All of a sudden, you have a dog that's lying in front of the fire, and it'll get up, it'll come over, and it'll start staring at you. And when you look away, he'll come round so that he can still get in front of you and look into your eyes. The staring thing is quite an uncanny thing. I know dogs communicate an awful lot with their eyes, but if you see a dog suddenly changing behavior and doing this, that's a sure sign. The other thing they do is they get as close as they can to you. Now, that could mean jumping up and sitting beside you, lying on your lap, pushing against you repeatedly. but getting as close as they can. Or sometimes you'll hear them whimpering or crying or vocalizing in some way. And then the other one is the nudging or pawing. Now, you saw Taz in that little video clip earlier on, constantly nudging. And now, different dogs will do different things, but those are the three principal things that you're looking for. So as I see this now, what's the point of me doing all that research if we don't do something about it? And how do we progress it? And I'm thinking that these are the ways. Contact people with difficult to manage epilepsy who actually own dogs at the moment. So they can be taught. I've done out a sort of a training program where you would go step by step through this little program, and you could be taught to train your own dogs to tell you you're going to have a seizure. So I think the way to do that is to maybe get these people together and say, look, this is how you do it. This is the technique you use. The other way of doing it, I thought, was there are some very good charities in Ireland at the minute, north and south, that train dogs for people who have got disabilities of one sort or another. Now, I don't see that it would be difficult to say to them, look, what about training one or two of your dogs to detect epilepsy for people? They already have the infrastructure there. They already have the trainers. And it's just a matter of saying, well, that's 2 out of 6 dogs we'll train to do this. And so that is basically the end of the presentation. But I'm happy to take as many questions as you feel you'd like to ask. And I'm sorry that it wasn't a bit longer, but I was a teacher for 30 years, and I always found the kids started to nod off after about 35 minutes, and I had them for an hour, so it was a bit difficult. So I hope that helps you.
Neil, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I don't think any of us are in the least bored, so you don't have to worry about any of us nodding off. So what I might ask you to do is to just stop sharing your screen, and that means we'll see a picture of you.
Yeah,
we have a couple of questions in through the chat function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask those, and then what I'll do is I'll stop the recording, and then if there's people who'd like to ask questions live, we'll have an opportunity to do that, because I'm aware that some people might want their faces on camera for that. So I'll start with the first one. So there's a question in, just wondering if deodorants or perfumes mask the scent that is probably emitted by seizures.
That's a very good question. So here's the thing. Dogs that are predicting epileptic seizure, in the survey that I did, and this survey now went to America, Australia, all over the world, none of those people had interrupted their normal daily cleaning, bathing methods. They were all showering as usual. They're always wearing perfume as usual. None of them did that. So when I got the samples, I said to people, don't do anything different to what you would normally do. Just give me the sample exactly as you are, whatever way that is. So it seems, in answer to that question, that no, it makes no difference at all. Now, this is not that surprising, really, because we think, when we're thinking about dogs, I think we tend to apply human rationale to them. Whereas what we need to do is remember that dogs have this super sensitive ability to isolate odors and to use that isolation. Like, I have a dog trained at the minute as a trailing dog. So basically, if somebody goes missing, we give him that person's odor through a pillowcase or a glove or something, and that dog can follow that person through the middle of a busy shopping center without any problem. He discriminates out all the other odors and follows just that one. So in that case, I felt that there was no issue around deodorants and so on.
That's great. Thank you, Neil. So the next question is, do you know, has anyone started research on the nose detector?
On the what?
Nose detector.
Oh, on the electronic nose. To my knowledge, yes, there will be some people doing that. I know that Dr. Ma is involved in this at some level in America, but I don't know if there's anybody actually doing the thing at the moment. I've tried to find out, but it's very difficult. In fact, I've approached, some of these companies that produce the type of Fitbit type watch to ask would they be interested in looking at this, and I haven't had a really overwhelming response from them. So that's something maybe like, why do we need to go outside Ireland? We've got enough expertise in Ireland. If we could do it ourselves, I'm sure.
And I know we've had that conversation about why isn't there the interest in it. That there is nobody. It's because it's so innovative. It could be something that could be used for other conditions, and why is nobody jumping on it?
Well, it's interesting because I'm back at Queen's doing research now at the moment, and my research is basically, so I have found that dogs are predicting diabetic highs and lows in exactly the same way as they're predicting epilepsy, and in the same time frames. So the research I'm engaged in at the moment is to look at a group of dogs that I know are predicting epilepsy, and then give them the odor of hypos and hypers and see do they react that in the same way. Now, according to the survey that was done by Dr. Debbie Wells at Queen's in 2008, dogs are able to do this prediction in the same way as seizures. So if that's the case, if there's a common odor, because both of these conditions are entirely different, what might that common odor be? I'm not a physiologist, but I suspect it's to do with physiological stress of some sort. And that is the odor that we'd be looking for.
Okay, thank you, Neil. So where and how can you get a trained dog, or can you train your own dog?
Right, so at the moment, there's nobody training dogs to do this reliably. Okay, so people who are using behavior changes to do it, like as far as I know now, Support Dogs UK do that, and they're very good. But as far as I know, it's not that reliable, and principally because if the dog's in another room, then how are they going to know you're about to have a seizure? So currently, there's nobody doing it. But the answer to the second part is yes, you can train your own dog to do that, and that's what I was trying to say. I have a program done out, which I'd be happy to share with people, and this is how you do it. It's not that difficult.
Okay, and so a follow-up question is, so my son has 2 dogs. We haven't noticed them being aware of seizures, but we'll keep an eye. He has numerous seizure types. However, can they be trained now at the age of 9 or 10, or is it better to start with a younger dog?
Oh, always better to start with young dogs, but I mean, an older dog can still do this. There's no truth to say that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I mean, look at me, I'm in my 70s and doing a PhD. Well, I've done a PhD. Like, that shouldn't be happening, but you can train a dog to do it, certainly, but you're better off with, say, a year old, something like that. Yeah, in and around that, but you can do it with an older dog.
Okay, then there's more questions about where is your training program available. So what we might do is, if people leave their details in the survey afterwards, or our email, we'll be able to maybe share some information on that, Neil, if that was okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so I suppose it's not really a question, it's more a comment. I want to get a German Shepherd to help me with independence and protection, but I'm worried about the cost and transport. I live alone. So I suppose, there are lots of things to take into consideration there.
Yeah, well, given the current sort of interest in the dreadful murder of Sarah Everard in London, that's another area that I work in as well. It concerns me greatly that people feel that in this day and age they need to get personal protection dogs or whatever. The problem with those dogs is that if they're not properly trained, they're a liability. And you also need to be aware that if a dog attacks somebody, whether it's personal protection dog or not, you could be in for a big law case. You need to be very careful about that. But it's a shame that we need to do that in this day and age, but understandable.
It is a shame indeed, yeah. So another kind of follow on, what breed of dogs would be the best for picking up the scents?
Well, in our study, all breeds were able to do it. The thing is that the traditional sort of dog would be Labradors and Retrievers and Springers and Shepherds and so on. What the problem we will have, I feel, is getting society to accept the fact that these are assistance dogs. So there needs to be some way of licensing dogs in Ireland that we don't have at the moment for epilepsy awareness. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure how you would go about that. A couple of people have actually asked me this question already. There's a lady in Galway, Karen Brown, who's a lovely lady, and she'll be quite happy for me to share her name. Has a little Jack Russell that is totally reliable, predicts all her seizures, but she can't take that little dog in public transport. She can't go into shops with it, and yet her life depends on it. In some case, it does depend on it, and that is something that I would love us to look at, or Epilepsy Ireland perhaps to look at, and see is there some way. I mean, I'd be quite happy to sign off a dog anytime, because I do a lot of behavior work as well here, with the Kennel Club and so on. But it's something we need to think about. There's not much point in training a dog if you can't take it into public areas where you really need it.
Yeah, so that's maybe an advocacy issue for the whole epilepsy community. Yes. The question, I think it's probably outside your scope of knowledge, Neil, but are they detecting cardiac issues?
Are there what?
Are they detecting cardiac issues? I think that's maybe a little bit outside your scope of research.
Cardiac, did you say?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, dogs do that. You see, if you think about it, it's probably this physiological stressor that I'm talking about. Whatever that odor is associated with physiological stress, I think it goes across a number of different conditions. I know of one person who has Addison's disease, and Addison's disease results in a sudden, as far as I understand it, a sudden drop in adrenaline levels and can lead to coma. Their dog started predicting their low adrenaline levels without any training whatsoever, in exactly the same way as the epilepsy dogs and diabetes dogs do. So, and I also know of people who have heart attacks where the dogs suddenly came to them and said, something's not right with you. And then shortly after they had a heart attack. So yes, I'm sure it is possible, but thankfully that would be a less frequent activity, I would hope, or event.
Exactly. So again, this is more of a comment than a question. So somebody is working with 2 dog trainers to train my 6-month-old Labrador to detect focal seizures and generalized seizures with positive results so far. He has shown signs of detecting my focal seizures by sitting in front of me or getting my partner's attention, which is very exciting for us. So that's good news.
That's very good. Yeah, I'd be interested in talking to whoever that person is.
Grant. So I'll keep note of the messages coming in, and we might be able to put you in touch with each other. So I am a person with epilepsy and have 4 pet dogs. Again, it's more of a comment. One of them is in particular keeps following me around in going up and coming down our stairs. Is this a sign? Depending if there's seizure activity.
Of course, you see, as I said, the main ways that dogs are doing is by staring, but they can paw you, or they can become very, very clingy, much more so than normal. And if that happens, that could be a sign for you.
So there's loads of questions coming in now. I don't know whether I should call a halt and see if people want to ask them live. So do you know if dogs can be trained or trained to be aware of petit mal, so focal seizures, vacant seizures, which this person gets?
Yes, of course. The way this works is that it doesn't matter what the seizure type is. In my survey, I think there were 40 different types of seizure, and the dogs were predicting across the whole range.
So I think that has come to the end. There's a question, but I'm not sure what about the relationship between owner and dog. So maybe if that person wants to ask it live, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording just in case anybody has questions that they want to ask and they want to turn their cameras on. And Cliona and Agnes, I think, are going to keep an eye and just make sure that we'll invite people to speak if they turn off their mics and turn on their cameras. Thank you. Thanks, Neil, so far.